Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we'll have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm feeling much better than I was last week, Jason. I had a cold, and it's been quite a while since I've had a cold, so I wasn't very happy over the weekend, but I'm feeling much better now.
Better than those poor people with that COVID Delta strain that's going around.
Much better than them, I'm certain, yes.
Yep. So news is that we are in lockdown in Perth.
Lockdown.
A very long one.
4 days, man.
4 days.
Oof, don't know how we're going to do it.
But yeah, obviously we've been using that to our advantage here in Perth, and not having too many infringements on our normal life. So
yeah, we're not actually complaining.
Yeah, no, we're not. No, we've got it pretty good. Everything else going well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's winter, it's cold, you have to get out of bed in the morning and it's cold, and you have to get the kid up and he doesn't want to get up because it's cold, and yeah, all of that normal stuff.
Yeah, well, we're recording today the morning following our second live panel, and that went really well. We had a number of people, and you were working very vigorously behind the scenes, answering questions and whatnot.
Ish.
Ish.
I was working. I was there, but I do appreciate the shout out and the credit that you gave me for the ISO work that I've been doing. So thank you, Jason.
No, the thought has crossed my mind. It'd be very easy for me, given that I am the face of the training, to just claim all the credit for myself. But then if anyone asks me any difficult questions about 45,003,
that's the catch-22 for you, isn't it? Do you take the credit and then take the risk that you'll be exposed?
Yeah. Now I'm very happy for you to be the ISO expert in this team.
Thanks.
But look, we've got another expert of a different type that we're going to bring on to the podcast now. She's actually the first lawyer to appear on the podcast. She works at the Leo Cussen Centre for Law, where she's a mentor and lawyer. And she's also actively involved with the International Bar Association, where she serves on a mental wellbeing working party. Welcome to the podcast, Desi Vlahos.
Thanks for having me, Jason and Joelle.
No, terrific. Really great to have connected with you recently on LinkedIn, and I've enjoyed the couple of conversations that we've had off air. And yeah, really looking forward to you being able to share something from the legal profession and around psych health and safety today.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's some really big changes that we're seeing, and can't wait to share them with you.
Yeah, terrific.
All right. Well, before we get into all of that, what do you like to listen to, Desi?
So I've only really been listening to podcasts the last couple of years, and it's really something that I like to do when I go on my walk or my run. But I've been really heavily involved in this podcast at the moment called Wind of Change, and it's quite aptly named after the song by the German rock band Scorpions. And I've got a bit of a sort of closet love for rock music. Don't tell anyone that, but probably sort of, instigated from the muso school I went to back in Perth back in the day. But it's really interesting. So it's sort of all history, it's music, it's conspiracy, it's espionage all in one. And the premise of that one's basically about back in 1990, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the West German band, the Scorpions, they released their ballad, Wind of Change. So you know the song I'm talking about, with all the earnest lyrics about, togetherness and the children of tomorrow. You'd think it was really about an anthem about the Cold War, but what it actually turns out, and what the podcaster really starts lifting the lid on, is the fact that there's reason to believe that hit ballad was actually, concocted and put together by the CIA to create, created in its aid to fight communism. It is part spy caper, part muso sort of investigation. It's got me hooked, and I'm kind of halfway through that and quite enjoying that a lot. I'm also listening to another one called You're Dead to Me. So I've got a couple of kids, and there was a sort of BBC show called Horrible Histories. I don't know if any of you've watched it, but I even love the stage shows. little bit nerdy, which I am as well, but it's in its second season now, and it covers topics from, Blackbeard the pirate to Scottish warlord Boudicar and the Spartans, and it's a bit of fun and a bit gross at the same time, and but it's the adult version, which thoroughly enjoying. So yeah, that's really grabbed me at the moment.
Yeah,
Nice.
I've seen a few episodes of Horrible Histories. Yeah. No, I'll have to check out that podcast.
Yeah, it's great.
There's nothing wrong with enjoying some rock music, Desi.
Oh, you quite like it too?
Yeah. I'm of the grunge generation, so
yes,
it's all about that for me.
Absolutely.
Well, Desi's of the same generation as us. Apparently, we were walking around Bush Court at Murdoch University at the same time. So,
well, that's right. I mean, I think when you grabbed your cup of tea before, I was telling Joelle that we must have just, walked past each other many, many times and not even realised. So, yeah.
20 years later, we finally connect.
Or, Jason could have been one of those dudes walking past you and saying, "Hey, smile. It can't be that bad." Never did that?
I didn't have game, but I didn't have that.
Well, that's not game.
That big absence of game, I was going to say.
I'm glad. All right. Well, can you tell us about your professional career then, Desi?
Yeah, sure, Joelle. Yeah, look, I started out my career as a lawyer, and I worked in mid-tier firms and also in private practice. I then took a bit of a career shift and moved into the education sector, and I became a secondary school teacher and taught legal studies and also literature as well. I'd always had a calling for education, for teaching. For anyone that knew me, and really, what really got me into education was this TED talk I saw once by a conductor, an English conductor called Benjamin Zander. I don't know if you've heard him give this TED talk, but he talks about leadership, and he talks about teaching as well, and he talks about the fact that as an educator as well, you've got that role to inspire, and the fact that a conductor ultimately doesn't make any sound. They depend on their power, their ability to make other people powerful, and what he talks about is that ability to awaken possibility in other people, and the measure of that was, he would always measure it by this, what he would call the shining eyes. And it was, for me, really that was sort of that measure of success for me as an educator as well, that if I could see those light bulb moments in my students, that was that measure of success for me. And I suppose you get sort of addicted to that feeling as well, and really making that connection with your students as well. So then I really very much married up the law and education. And for the past 5 years, I've been working primarily as a mentor and lecturer of practical legal training. So it's very much sort of endearingly referred to as PLT, around Australia. And what it is it's a structured training program designed to help students develop the practical skills required for an entry-level lawyer for admission to practice. So, I mean, I don't know if you're aware, we used to sort of, and I did what was called articles or article clerkships. So that no longer exists in Australia now. Rather, now there is a practical legal training program, or there's a supervised workplace training program that graduates will complete after university to be admitted as Australian practicing lawyers. So that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years, and look, thoroughly enjoy what I do. I'm also a mental health first aid facilitator for the legal profession as well. So really, the impetus of that program wasn't so much the accreditation, more it was the realisation that within the legal profession, there wasn't much mental health literacy. And I suppose this was a way also to start really getting the conversation going, because primarily the impetus behind the program is to encourage people in having a courageous conversation with someone if they notice that, something's a little bit different, they're not acting in the way that they normally would, and just to really just connect them to those professional supports through having a really sort of casual conversation with them. Or then, on the other end is, if that person is in crisis, trying to connect them to that support, very much like a physical first aider would as well. And look, it's been gaining a lot of traction within the legal profession. And there's a lot of workplace health and safety lawyers in the profession in Australia that have been advocating really from that risk management perspective as well, that, it is something to have a think about in a workplace as well, ensuring that you potentially have a mental health first aider, particularly in an industry where stigma is quite pervasive, and people don't generally really comfortably talk about their mental health in the workplace. So, as I said, it's been gaining a lot of traction, and we have seen even, a couple of chief executive partners come along to some of the sessions that I've run as well, and, really great feedback about, just some of the skills that they're learning, connecting people to appropriate supports. But so that's sort of my career so far, Joelle.
Fantastic that you're getting the sort of the senior leadership participation in those programs as well. Was there something in particular that sort of prompted your interest in mental health in the legal field?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose, so obviously, education and law and teaching was very much, so how it sort of started off. But, as I started sort of segueing to looking at that sort of my interest in advocacy in mental health, really sort of ignited back in about 2018. So one of I had a couple of cohorts at the time of the practical legal training program, were involved there was a Royal Commission back in 2018, and it was the Royal Commission, what they refer to it as the Hayne Royal Commission into misconduct in the banking, superannuation and financial services industry. Now, I don't know what you know about that, but in terms of, just the way it was dealt with as well. But, to give you a bit of an overview, there were some really tight deadlines and turnaround times. And look, it's no secret, but, lawyers and graduates particularly as well, were forced, to work, things like 15-hour days, 7 days a week, in order to actually gather the evidence for their clients. And if a client, for example, and we're talking about the big banks, because my cohorts that I was looking after at the time in my practical legal training, my role as a lecturer for that course, a lot of these graduates were, seconded to the Royal Commission. And a lot of the clients of the firms were some of the big banks, and they were required to respond to notices for documents. And, lawyers would start working at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was quite normal for them to finish at 12 o'clock every night during the commission. So there was a huge amount of work to do in such a, small amount of time, and, in order to meet those deadlines. So I was quite privy to those challenges. I would, I would regularly, catch up with my graduates at the time, and I could see these, the stresses really manifesting as well. I don't know whether we're going to have a chat about sort of what happened, but I mean, I can sort of talk through what we saw as a result of that. But what the Royal Commission actually had the effect of highlighting was the broader culture of excessive workloads across the profession. And, I suppose I shouldn't be so cynical about it, but I was quite immersed in this sort of disempowered role of seeing my graduates really sort of, floundering and not really having any ability to be able to assist them. So what actually happened was the brakes actually weren't put on until an employee who happened to be a graduate at the time at one of the firms that was on the commission made a complaint to WorkSafe Victoria that the staff were actually working really unsafe hours to meet the punishing Royal Commission deadlines. And then what sort of ensued as a result of that was a WorkSafe Victoria and Safe Work New South Wales investigation, where improvement notices were actually issued for alleged health and safety breaches for several firms. And that actually happened in 2019, but that was a first of its kind in the legal industry. And as a result of that, new rules were introduced in the Fair Work Commission in response to those investigations, which now require all hours worked by graduate lawyers and paralegals, no matter how high their salary, to ensure they're not paid below the minimum rates or losing out on penalties as a result of the long hours. So it's a sort of way that these rules were introduced to protect graduates and paralegals. On the other end of the stick, once they become, admitted to practice, though, they're not subject to the awards. So, there was a lot of sort of, talk about that, as not, being sort of adequate measure to protect those early lawyers. And what we see from the data and statistics of all the surveys, including what we're going to be talking about a bit later about the IBA survey, that it is young, early lawyers that are most at risk. So that was a sort of, factor that sort of shook up the legal profession a couple of years back. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned the IBA, the International Bar Association. You're quite heavily involved with them.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about it. So most of our listeners, I don't think, are lawyers. So tell us about what is the IBA?
Yeah, sure. Well, the IBA stands for the International Bar Association, and really it's the foremost organisation for international legal practitioners, and it includes bar associations and law societies. Seeing that I like my history buff, it started up in 1947. So you can sort of see, from, historically where that falls. It was very shortly after the creation of the United Nations. And it does have an important piece there, because the IBA was sort of born out of conviction that organisations made up of the world's bar associations can positively contribute to global stability and peace through the administration of justice. And that's very much, as a lawyer as well, we're held to very high ethical standards. And in terms of the duties duties and obligations that are imposed on lawyers, sort of even internationally, it is one of our primary duties is about the administration of justice. And really from thereafter, so in those sort of ensuing 70 years since its creation, the organisation has evolved from an association comprising of, bar associations and law societies to one that sort of encompasses individual international lawyers and also entire law firms as well. So just to give you a bit of a snapshot, the membership now is about 80,000, of international lawyers from, the majority of the world's leading firms, some 190 bar associations, and it spans about 170 countries. So it's about, the International Bar Association's aims is about providing assistance to the global legal community through its global membership and its influences in the development of international law reform and really shaping the future of legal profession throughout the world. So yeah, that's the IBA in a nutshell.
So you are involved in a task force there at the moment. That's correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And can you tell us a bit about that task
Absolutely.
force? Yeah. Why was it established? What's its focus? What are you doing as part of your role?
Absolutely. So in April last year, there was obviously in response to COVID and, the uncertainties of what was happening. And if you think about April last year, everything sort of started locking down. There was a lot of uncertainty in the atmosphere as well. People didn't know what was happening with their jobs. Some people were being furloughed. There was mass remote work was the default amongst the profession internationally. And there was a webinar that was conducted by the European Regional Forum of the IBA, which really looked at exploring the challenges currently faced by law firms in developing working practices in response to the COVID pandemic. And what it looked to address was the impact of the COVID outbreak and and basically our responses it had on our working lives, benefits and opportunities from these challenges, and how firms can adapt their workplace practices in light of these challenges, and also the fact that law firms are increasingly seeking to promote the importance of emotionally, psychologically, mentally healthy workplaces, and at the same time demonstrate their acceptance and respect for the rights, diversity, and contribution of their staff. So that's what that webinar really looked to address. And as a result of that, the outgoing president at the time, who realised that there was concern and like a cause for global concern because the current environment and atmosphere in the legal profession was leading to lawyer burnout, significant mental health issues, and in worst cases, suicide. So this task force was set up in November 2020. And I sit on the Wellbeing Taskforce with my colleague from New South Wales. And the key initial phase of the project was releasing 2 surveys, so one for individual lawyers and one for institutions, where we received just over 3,000 responses. I think there was a little bit of survey fatigue last year, because I'm not sure if you're aware, there was a big survey that went out in regard to bullying and sexual harassment in the legal profession back in 2019 by the IBA, which sort of, garnered just over 7,000 plus responses. But the results of these surveys demonstrate that the culture and the practice of law can have a negative effect and impact on mental health and wellbeing of those working in it as well. So that's why wellbeing should be of central importance to the international legal community and the profession as a whole. So sort of the Wellbeing Taskforce was set up firstly, to gather the data and then to look at what we're going to do there. So to bring together representatives of organisations from different jurisdictions and really share that information that we have, to really just compare the data. So is it sort of just, really look at the different regional forums around in which the IBA has, people that are members as well, and then to identify the issues and concerns that are common, with a view to implementing particular initiatives and interventions that are most going to benefit lawyers around the world, because as it currently sort of stands, there's not really any sort of information sharing platforms in place, and there seems to be a lot of uncertainty about what to do, how to approach it. And not only that, there's sort of, and I know that you talk a lot about sort of language as well, Jason. In particular countries, you mentioned the word mental health, and you just get this really sort of negative reaction from, from some jurisdictions as well. And it's primarily because they don't really know what it is or what it means in that context as well. So it can be met with sort of, not met positively.
Yeah. Now, you did tell me in one of our previous conversations that you've had one of our podcast regulars now, Carlo Caponecchia, to address that working, or the task group about ISO 45003. So what was, behind getting him to talk to them about the standard?
Absolutely. And I'm sure he would be fine with me sort of sharing just how that sort of panned out. It's really interesting sort of, and I think Carlo and I have subsequently, talked about this, that just our approach in Australia is slightly different to, I suppose, the way, say Europe, for example, would approach it as well. I think Australia is sort of at a situation where we're recognising that, these soft approaches are really not working, okay? Compensation claims are going up. We're seeing significant burnout in the profession, which we'll be chatting about as well. In Australia, for example, we've been doing a lot of these surveys since as early as 2006 into lawyer mental health and wellbeing, okay? But nothing's changed, okay? As we said, we've thrown the fruit bowls, we've thrown the yoga, we've done a bit of mental health first aid on the side, but nothing is sort of changing. And I suppose with the introduction of ISO 45003, that's sort of been put on the table now to say, well, hang on a minute. Yes, whilst it's all well and good, to have all these initiatives in place and, different sorts of things that we can do to, further promote, our psychological health as well. At the end of the day, there is going to be a grandiose need for some form of regulation, or at least something to have it, in concrete, to work towards from an organisational perspective. And that's what Carlo, he was involved in the task force to really talk about the approach in Australia and how it's going to need sort of that two-pronged approach. So, we do need to have that risk management perspective as well, in terms of management of psychological health and safety, and whilst also promoting those protective factors, which then really is really trying to, flip it on its lid to show firms that it's not being, being too soft, hearted and compassionate. What it is about is realising, and you can see all the return on investment data as well that points, in that direction as well, that by ensuring that your staff are psychologically safe and that they do have that trust embedded within an organisation, you're going to have that loyalty, and that's what's going to generate that social capital and resilience, which is going to then lead to that competitive advantage. And I think that's sort of what, we're going to be sort of working towards, that it is that two-pronged approach. And I don't think that we could just rely on these soft approaches and it's the moral or it's the right thing to do, because honestly, I mean, I don't know exactly what you both think, but I think we're sort of beyond that now. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting here 10 years later talking about exactly the same thing in the legal profession.
Well, funnily, Joelle and I have been making the rounds and having some face-to-face conversations prior to this lockdown anyway. And we're hearing the same thing from large corporations. They're like, we've been doing wellbeing for years. We're not seeing any benefits, or we've reached a cap in terms of the benefits that we're seeing. We really need to start moving to risk management. So people are understanding the need for that systemic, as Carlo no doubt would have talked about, the cake. We've got to have the cake first before we put the icing on it. So.
And I think that's such a great analogy, because it is. I mean, and I've been using, and that's what I said to him. I said, I hope you don't mind if I steal that. I said, I really like that. In saying that, I sometimes steal some of the things that you and Joelle talk about as well. And we'll probably talk about that when we talk about psychosocial hazard as well. But the truth is, if the cake is flawed to start with, or it's even like making a cake, when it sort of sinks in the center and you're like, what am I going to do? I better put some cream in there. But the truth, people are going to realise that it's, the cake's flawed. So no amount of icing, no amount of, yoga, fruit bowls, what do they call it? The triple F, flu shots, fruit bowls and fitness. I think I read somewhere is really going to fix a situation when the work design is flawed to start with. Yep. And I think that's what we're seeing in the legal profession, that, there are a lot of flaws. And it's only been sort of exacerbated by, changes in technology, globalization, different sort of processes, the competitive marketplace as well, which is just sort of piling on extra pressures. And, and people are sort of being sent away to manage their own resilience, rather than actually saying, well, hang on a minute, let's strip this back. Let's look at the work design, and let's look at this, because it's going to benefit the organisation. It's going to lead us to a more profitable business. It's going to make us more competitive as well. I always like to think, when you look at the attrition rates in the profession as well, there was a study done back in 2012 called the National Attrition and Re-Engagement Survey, which demonstrated a lot of the drivers of legal professionals from practice. And, a lot of these stresses, came up as, a lot of the main reasons, as was work-life balance. We've seen a bit of a shift with that, with COVID, and firms realising, well, hey, that traditional 9 to 5, we can laugh about that. No one really works 9 to 5 as a lawyer, but that 9 to 5 traditional working environment is going, is the norm. And we're sort of seeing a lot of firms now, especially some of the top tier firms are starting to show their commitment to a 60-40 flexible work arrangement. But that's only sort of one aspect. There also needs to be, a really clear and careful analysis of all of the other situational factors.
Yeah. I'm definitely don't claim to be as eloquent as Carlo. But I like to say, it doesn't matter how much mindfulness you do if you're working 14-hour days and your boss is a prick, right? Like you need to think about like that two-pronged approach, right? We can't just keep pushing it down on the individual. We also need to consider the work environment factors and how work is designed.
So let's actually talk about that. Desi, a lot of the time when we talk about sort of psychosocial hazards, people think about frontline responders as being the people who are most likely to be exposed to that, so people who sort of are witnessing these traumatic events as they're unfolding. Probably people don't think about lawyers in that same perspective, but I think it's definitely an issue for a lot of lawyers. So can you talk to us a bit about the sort of biggest psychosocial hazards for the law profession?
Yeah, definitely, Joelle. Yeah, look, I suppose, and the IBA survey really highlighted some of these factors. And it highlighted the fact that, the long hours, there's the pressure to meet the billables and also generate billables as well. And that generation of business for the firm as well. And I don't know how much you know about sort of the billable hour. It's just been long debated that, that it serves no benefit to the firm. and for the workers. It puts this, extra layer of pressure. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well when we talk about sort of the changes, the technological changes as well. There's also tight and unexpected deadlines, the unbalanced workload, also pressure to deliver best outcomes for the clients as well. In delivering those best outcomes for the clients, no matter the circumstances and rapidly changing technologies. And I suppose that's really been made evident by the pandemic as well. And all of these sorts of things are causes of psychosocial hazard. When we look at that billable hour as being really problematic, really, when you look at, when you go out into practice as well and you work at a firm, they talk about the 6-minute unit. So every 6 minutes equates to a unit of time. And then you will bill at that sort of, depending on what your hourly rate is. And that's been ingrained in legal practice and sort of, affords partners of firms the ability to maximise that gross income from services of employed lawyers, really as a quantitative tool for management of comparing performance and also promoting competition between lawyers as well. But the problem is that lawyers are under considerable pressures to achieve their billable hours. And that becomes the focus rather than looking at the big picture and saying, well, what am I actually here for? I'm here to solve a client's problem. And essentially that's what you are as a lawyer. You're there to solve a problem. You're not there to sit there primarily focused on, well, what am I going to do? I need to bill X amount of hours, today. And often what this causes is, sort of ethical issues as well in terms of people, powering these pressures by inflating timesheets, like in terms of that, and also it increases anxiety and fear about not meeting those targets and being performance managed as well. So we see that's a really big problem. We see there's a lot of the competing demands constantly as well. The inability to sort of manage your workday creates a lot of pressure as well. So particularly if you're working in practice areas such as disputes or where you've got sort of deadlines and turnaround times, that managing that sort of work-life balance is very difficult in those situations as well. Other things including sort of, we can see, courts, bosses and colleagues also hold us to equally high standards as well. So there is this constant pressure to perform without an opportunity to, for rest and recovery as well. So we see a lot of these different factors as, playing into and, creating a lot of psychosocial risk as well for lawyers as well. The other thing I was going to probably raise as well is there's been a lot of talk around vicarious trauma, and I think we were chatting about it as well. We can see, and we'll probably talk about it as well at some stage, that we know that vicarious trauma is something that is experienced in particular practice areas such as in the criminal jurisdiction, family law, and also people that are dealing in children's matters as well. We were saying as well before that it's quite an under-resourced area. And there's not really any sort of direction as to what to do in the situation and how to implement measures that are going to to alleviate that from occurring as well. But we've seen that particularly with lawyers as well in those areas, but also in the judiciary. We've seen a lot of issues in that regard as well, where people are constantly being exposed to such material which can affect their psychological health and safety. So yeah.
So it's not just the lawyers that are experiencing that vicarious trauma, then it's the judges and other sort of court officers are exposed.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it is. That's right. Well, I suppose if you're constantly being subjected to listening to this material, then without that opportunity to be able to debrief or to adequately deal with that, then, it's going to have that impact. And I suppose there's been a few initiatives that have been, sort of put forward. And I know there was one a couple of years ago called the Supporting Judicial Resilience Program, which was a sort of 6-month pilot program involving 20 judges, and where they actually brought on, 20 mental health professionals to engage in some one-on-one debriefing, counselling and supervision in order to really enhance individual judges' capacity to manage stress and exposure to vicarious trauma. So, there was a real commitment, to roll this out for judges, as part of the court's acknowledgement that there was, of the impact of the work of the court on judges and its commitment to looking after the health and well-being of judges. Really, that's what the most obvious by no means is, as we said, the area of vicarious trauma, are these quite sensitive matters as well, which is an increasingly, is an increasing part of the criminal court load as well. So, it is by no means just confined to that area. I mean, I suppose, exposure to sort of unrelenting caseloads as well by road users, for example, workers unable to resume their pre-injury lives, in those sort of instances can also sort of result in vicarious trauma as well. But more predominantly, we see in the more sort of sensitive material that a lot of our judiciary experience in that as well. So, yeah.
Mm. I mean, obviously, psychologists are another group of people who are at risk of vicarious trauma. But I think that, a lot of our training involves, reflective practice, and, we've got requirements for sort of peer consultation and all of that sort of thing to help us be aware of, I guess, the level of weight that's resting on our shoulders at any point in time, and how to respond to that, and clinical practice have controls in place to to reduce burden on any one individual and to sort of avoid trauma triggers for people. Is any of that covered in sort of the training for lawyers?
Oh no, Joelle, it's really sad, isn't it? No, it's not, and that's the problem. And look, I've had a lot of conversations, even as a mental health first aider. I've had sort of cohorts of participants that sort of work in some of these sectors as well. And, when we sort of go offline after the course and have a really sort of earnest sort of chat, I even say, so what sort of, mechanisms are in place, or what sort of initiatives are there, in order to sort of debrief or have these peer consultations? And they just looked at me and they said, do you know what we rely on? And I said, what? And they said, humour. And I said, God, humour. I mean, if that's all that's out there, look, I know some of the different law societies have a EAP service that's accessible to its members, and there was a mentorship program that was running through a lot of the law societies, such as the Law Institute of Victoria. But in terms of sort of, like structured programs that are specific for, people in these areas, there's really not much out there. I don't know sort of the intimate sort of details of some organisations and whether they do sort of out, bring in psychologists or have programs as well. But there is sort of no training from early days. So from university, even from a sort of training perspective, practical legal training perspective, that doesn't exist. And we sort of just let them out into the profession without the skill set to be able to manage and to be able to deal with these situations. So there isn't, and it absolutely needs to be better resourced. But I think as well to recognise the risks to the person and also to an organisation if something was to manifest as well. And I think that was when I was chatting about, one of those cases, one of the most recent cases here in Victoria, which really looked at the fact that employers have that duty of care to ensure that the health and safety of their employees at all times as well, particularly when they're being exposed to such sorts of material that could lead to psychological hazard for them and potential development of mental health concern, which was the case in one of the most recent cases here in Victoria.
Yeah, so you've mentioned a few psych hazards that are prevalent in practicing law, so vicarious trauma being one. You also talked about low job control. You talked about high workloads, obviously, and just sheer working hours. What are the consequences for the mental health of lawyers if these hazards aren't managed properly?
Yeah, sure. I think, when we're looking at some of these psych hazards as well, it's really important to look at the fact that law is a highly regulated profession internally as well. So, as I was talking about before, we're held to very high ethical standards. We have these duties, obligations upon us as well. The law has its own, the profession, I should say, has its own uniform law with conduct rules that are embedded within that uniform law. And in terms of psychosocial hazard, those conduct rules don't really address anything but discrimination, sexual harassment, and workplace bullying. Anything else, so in management of workload, things like that, they're not sort of regulated in that regard as well. The Legal Services Board and Commissioner in Victoria really is driving the need for there to be sort of changes and systemic changes. And she's even pointed towards, this is Fiona McClay, has pointed towards regulation, in regard to ensuring the psychological health and safety of employees as well. Otherwise, I think even she said we're going to be sitting here in the next 10 years, nothing's really going to have changed. She also looks at the fact that, in other sort of disciplines and industries, they've been much better able to manage, the psychological health and safety, but law sort of seems to have, sort of stagnated and not really, there's been any changes. In terms of consequences, well, we see, practitioners burning out, Jason, and the burnout rate is just escalating. That sense of exhaustion, cynicism, that reduced self-efficacy as well. I talked about that NAS study that was done in 2012, which, showed a lot of the drivers from the profession. There's sort of anecdotal evidence that sort of points towards the fact that by the 5-year mark, lawyers, early lawyers will have left 50% of lawyers will have left the profession by the 5-year mark. So, really looking at that as well is definitely some of the reasons why we're seeing, especially with our early lawyers, if the factors are not managed for them, we're seeing them sort of just drop out of the profession altogether. And it's really difficult when you're trying to, fledge a really robust and long career as well, when we're seeing this attrition rate escalating. So, yeah, look, I mean, it can, as I said, with burnout, we can see lots of other things such as, manifestation of mental health concerns as well.
Yeah, interesting. The early career lawyers, we see the same in teachers, right? So grads, a lot of them, turning over within the first few years of service. And it's a real shame, given obviously the commitment that people make to their studies to first of all get the grades to get into, say, to study law, pass all of the required practical requirements and all the rest to become a practicing lawyer, and then they're out of the profession in 5 years. It's really sad.
Oh, absolutely, it is very sad, and I think even from the survey findings from the IBA, it really just pointed towards a couple of different reasons why we are losing our early lawyers as well. But, quite interestingly, and I hate using the term work-life balance, I just think it's so cliched, but they did use it in the survey, that I think in those early years, it is management of stress and workload, and really just trying to balance that work-life, balance. And I think it really has to do, you mentioned that level of decision latitude and autonomy. And I think in those early years of practice, they are difficult to sort of have mastery over, because you're so, freshly minted. You're not going to have that level of competence in a task. So therefore your supervisor's not going to give you autonomy. And I think there's sort of that cycle will, people want to have that control and they can't get it. So then they think, well, I'm either going to move on because maybe I'm not good enough, or these sorts of things as well, or they drop out of the profession as well. So I think really looking at those aspects such as autonomy of workload, and trying, from an employer's perspective, and trying to sort of give back some level of autonomy as well, because that's when people are going to feel as though they've got mastery over their task as well. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, but it's also interesting to hear that it's sort of it's also in the teaching profession as well.
So I was going to ask you how those hazards have been managed traditionally within the legal professions, and it sounds like they haven't. Have you seen any sort of successful strategies that you can share?
I can. So I suppose if we're looking at it sort of from what's sort of been done, there were some guidelines that were drafted called, I don't know if you've heard of them, they're the Tristan Jepson Memorial Foundation Best Practice Guidelines for Psychologically Healthy Workplaces. So it's got such a big, long sort of title. Now, the sort of information behind that is there was a survey conducted back in 2009 called by the Brain and Mind Research Institute. I think we chatted about that, Jason, on one of our other calls that we had. But that study was called Courting the Blues. And it was commissioned by the Tristan Jepson Memorial Foundation. So it was the family of a young lawyer who took his life in practice. And really, that was sort of the main survey that's been conducted in Australia, really delving into, what are these factors what are the stresses in the legal profession? What does lead to deterioration of lawyer wellbeing? And I probably haven't shared the fact that in the general population, we talk about, it's probably about 1 in 5 people will experience a mental health condition at some stage in their lives or at any given year. But in the legal profession, it's 1 in 3. And that Brain and Mind Research Institute really elevated the fact that, it's 33% of lawyers, 20% of barristers will experience a mental health disorder at some stage in their careers. So in terms of what's been done, so that from that survey, then these best practice guidelines were developed, where they took on some of the research that had been conducted by the American Bar Association and the Canadian Bar, who are doing some really phenomenal work and drafting these psychologically healthy guidelines. And it was about getting organisations and firms to sign up to these best practice guidelines and looking at, some of the different sorts of things that's going to ensure people are adhering to, instituting different factors in a workplace that's going to ensure as much, psychological safety in the workplace. So, there's a number of firms that, signed up to that. But I suppose, these have been in place for some time, but we still saw, we still have seen, as I said, what we saw with the Royal Commission, that there seems to still be, a lot of, irrespective of the fact you've got these guidelines in place, they are still guidelines. So they're not sort of, a stronger sense of, well, this is what you should be doing, rather than this is sort of, this would be nice if you did it this way. This is what's going to encourage, psychological safety in the workplace. And I think it was a step in the right direction, but I think it really is time for, a stronger approach to ensure, the psychological safety for workers and employees. Otherwise, I think we're going to be losing some, really fantastic people. So, so that's what I've seen really to date.
One of the other things we've spoken about in previous chats, Desi, is this idea of legal exceptionalism. Do you have any comments on how maybe the structure of law firms maybe encourage this from a cultural perspective?
Yeah, for sure. So where do you start with this? It's really interesting. I suppose it's really sort of stripping it back, Jason, and really looking at sort of the business model of practice. And I think this is where a lot of the problems sort of have, sort of stemmed from. We know that, and really to look at, the practice of law has always sort of operated as a guild. Do you know what I mean? So what's happened, we're seeing a lot of sort of changes as well. And it hasn't really been recognised as a competitive market sort of until recently. And, what we can see as well is that, there's been significant changes in the profit models for both commercial and legal advice, and also for small business. And I suppose, as I was saying before, that it's that growth, it's that industrialisation, commercialisation of large corporates, the contestation of law firm, the profit orientation and finalisation of plight firms as well. There's also been changes in funding and regulation of law schools, where you've seen sort of, withdrawing of public funding from unis, law degrees and profit centres. And we saw this last year. Only now, unis, people wanting to study law, there's been a real big price hike for their law degree now. So, whereas they'd have to pay, $11,000 annually, they now have to pay almost $15,000 as well. And I suppose all these factors sort of make lawyers' employment and careers sort of less certain and secure, more competitive, and sort of more liquid. In terms of the exceptionalism that, how I sort of see it as well, it's interesting because I think that when lawyers are sort of measured by input, hours and business orientation, And today's, business climate and law included focuses on output, results and value, and, sort of the achievement of client objective relative to the cost. So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of shift those traditional sort of ways of viewing it to seeing it sort of in a bigger picture, that they're not sort of, the legal profession is subject to workplace health and safety, occupational health and safety legislation, as are all businesses, but really get them to see that the way that law has been practiced needs to shift, that these models are not successful, and that, as we were talking about in terms of social capital, that shifting to an environment where people are feeling safe, they are feeling empowered to be able to speak up in the organisation as well if there's something. With that consultation, that's what's going to lead to better designed organisations, which will ultimately be more competitive in the long run. It will ensure that the retention of staff is much better as well. And ultimately the productivity will be increased as well. But it's a really interesting beast, Jason, this exceptionalism, and something that the IBA are really looking at in their next phase of the project, trying to hone in on. One of the statistics, that came back from the data was that 73% of organisations profess to have wellbeing initiatives in place, but only 17% of people in positions of management have had any sort of training. So I think really it needs to have that, that full commitment, that top-down approach, where right from the beginning, we are really asking people in positions of management to strip it back, to reverse engineer the system and to look at the benefits, to reassess it, to not see themselves in this lens of being exceptional and that nobody else can do the job. Because the way the world is going now with technological advancement and globalization, consumers are sort of driving the business somewhat as well. And a lot of consumers are realizing that it's not, there are sort of other ways around solving sort of legal problems. We're looking at, I think you mentioned AI. Well, that is a great threat to the legal profession as well, because you may not necessarily need a lawyer to complete a task. And I think all of this sort of plays into it. And I think the success of a firm in this marketplace is going to be if they really strip it back, look at those sort of those moral values that are sort of underpinning the organisation and the firm as well, and realise through that consultation what's going to best suit their organisation. And I think that's when they're going to have that competitive advantage over others.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see how this permeates down in not just law firms, but all organisations. I really feel, line managers, top management, they all need to have competence, right, in understanding what are psych hazards and what could we be doing practically to improve in this area over time. But it's something that you don't see. And even in some of the recent discussions that Joelle and I have been having with clients, they're looking at psychosocial risk assessment like you would a employee engagement survey, where a central function like HR gets all the data and they go, oh, great, now we know what to do. So we're just going to create these global things that we're going to roll out for everyone, or not roll out. We're going to do that 6 months after we've collected the data. So surely the data is still relevant 6 months later, because things don't change much in 6 months, right? But they're not getting down to that team level, where I think we really need that competence from the line leaders, and having those conversations at that work group level, because the hazards can be so different from group to group. Interesting what you say about artificial intelligence. I've been hearing that actually for the last couple of years, how that's a huge disruptor to the legal profession. So do you see law firms actually looking at how they can evolve, or what they can offer in terms of the commercial offering that is going to help them to compete against AI? And like you say, the need, or the lack of need then to engage lawyers?
That's a really good, sorry, I'm getting this really funny message that keeps popping up. I think I suppose a lot of firms are doing that SWOT analysis and really looking at, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And, AI is definitely something that is starting to, filter in as well. And I suppose, you can either sort of fight it, or you can sort of utilize, different sorts of technological, innovative sort of measures within an organization. And I think that's what's going to give people that competitive edge as well, that if they do sort of adapt these, rather than sort of see it from that lens of exceptionalism and say, well, no, only lawyer can do this task. The reality is, no, with different sorts of things where you can see things like smart contracts, for example, and blockchain, how that has sort of, taken out the lawyer middleman in some of these scenarios as well. What I suppose AI will never sort of be able to meet is, things such as, the empathy, the rapport, things like that as well. And that's, I suppose, some of those, what they refer to as those soft skills, that will always need that lawyer involvement, to forge that trust with clients as well. And that will be very much synonymous with, particular sort of practice areas as well. But look, that's pretty much what I've seen in that area as well.
But also, as you said, the high level problem solving, right? Like the law firm is there to solve client problems, and
Yes.
writing up a contract, or something that is pretty much boilerplate with a few words changed, pretty easy for AI to do. But
Absolutely.
to really understand all the nuances of an organization, and the different legal requirements, AI is going to have a few more difficulties to overcome in that. So I think, lawyers, that's where they should be focusing their attention, right? Not just, as you say, on those 6-minute incremental billable hours, but what is the real value that we're providing to our clients, not just something that could be hammered out by a machine.
Absolutely. And I think, for the firms that do realise that, and they do strip it back, and they realise that what is the end game out of this as well, what's going to be most suitable in this evolving marketplace. And not only that, they're also future planning and saying, well, where are we working towards, both in regard to technology, but also in regard to the maintenance of, robust, innovative workforces that are psychologically safe as well, which is then going to maintain, the workforce retention rates will be, you'll obviously have, retain your staff, you'll have trust. And it's really important as well, to be retaining your staff. You don't want to be turning staff over all the time, because you want that loyalty in an organisation as well. It's also for career progression and all sorts of different things as well. But yeah, look, it's really interesting, that sort of argument as well from an AI perspective too.
So you've talked a little bit about, looking to the future and what law firms can do to maintain a sustainable competitive advantage. Is there any other sort of areas that you feel they should be working towards?
I just think really just sort of from a psych health and safety sort of perspective, you're thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think it's, as I was saying before, it's, I think, we've been looking at this data for a number of years now, particularly in Australia since 2006. What we have found out from the IBA survey really just confirms what we already knew from what was happening in Australia. So really it's about really focusing on top management now, okay, because they're the decision makers. They've got all the power to be able to, make the changes that's needed. The recognition is that there are, the practice of law can have negative effects on well-being if the work design is not right. So no amount of as we said, these sorts of, fluffy initiatives are going to alleviate these scenarios. I think there was this psychologist called Christina Maslach who talked about the canary in the coal mine. She said, it's like saying, you've got this lovely bird that's singing, and in it goes to the coal mine, and it comes out and it's not singing anymore. And it's, when we look at that situation and we say, well, how did the bird make itself sick? Well, that's a very bit of a silly question, because we know why it got sick, because it was in the coal mine, covered in soot. So similar sort of thing. I think it's about firms as well realising to not individualise the discourse as well, that it's not about putting all the onus on individuals to manage their own well-being as well, that they do need to look at it from those systemic levels, and to reassess from, the whole system itself needs to look at the way it has practiced law. and to really look at the ways that's going to be beneficial, both in terms from a moral sort of perspective, an ethical perspective as well. And that's really important as well from an ethical perspective. Some of the data from a lot of the surveys that have been conducted around Australia suggest that 80% of disciplinary matters have an underlying mental health condition at their core. So we're saying then that, a lawyer who's unwell is not going to be the best lawyer they're going to be. What is that going to say in terms of the administration of justice for clients? Okay, how can you then discipline a lawyer for being unwell because of the systemic factors and the psychosocial hazards in the workplace that are not managed properly? And I just think, how ethical is that for us, that if we're disciplining them because of the way that the structure has been arranged without ensuring that the right safeguards are in place to protect psychological safety, I just think that is just so unethical in itself. So I think the competitive advantage is going to be when firms realise, and when you get, more chief executive partners really doing those deep dives into the way that the structure and the management and the system has been created, and really sort of reverse engineering it with that meaningful consultation with their employees. And we've seen, sorts of different organisations talk about where, they'll have little sort of check-ins and talk collectively at all different levels about, what changes, what are some of the technological changes, what are some of the stresses that they're experiencing, and these sorts of things as well, to try and really flesh out all of the different issues. And I think, once the decision makers, get wind of that, I think that is when you'll start seeing those high-performing workforces, which will give them that competitive advantage. And then I think the idea then, Joelle, I think is then that they will be the envy of everyone else. And I heard Lucy Brogden, I think in one of the podcasts that you had, I think that's what's going to be the secret, I think. I think it's about, sort of using competition to leverage, that opportunity. So other firms will look at others and realise sort of, retention of staff, profitability, those sorts of things as well. And also being an employer of choice. And I've seen that very recently with, a particular firm that I've had a little bit of involvement with, that, all of these sorts of factors, the fact that they do, have regard for, for psychological health and safety, wellbeing, and ensure these safeguards are in place is what's going to create that performing team.
Yeah, this is some great insights, Desi, and you've given us a really great first-hand view into what it is like to work in a law firm and the psych hazards that are present, and obviously lots of room for improvement. So on that note, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
Oh dear. Oh, where do we start there? Gosh. In the legal profession, you say?
Yeah, let's just keep it to the legal profession.
I know.
It seems like
I could get on my soapbox now and to keep going. Look, I think it is, and I'm going to be quite honest here in saying that. Look, I've spoken with some of my colleagues on the IBA. When we're talking about, mental health and, psychological safety in the workplace, for law firms, it is going to be very, what we're asking them to do is to go to sort of, quite a scary place to really wind it back and to look at, the structures that are in place, to look at very specifically what are these factors in the workplace that could potentially pose risk, okay? Because we know that the physical hazards are very easily recognisable, but those psychological hazards are not so easily recognisable. And I think we use that sort of and demonstrate that even in mental health first aid, when we talk about when someone's limping, you'll say, oh, what's wrong with your foot? But if you've noticed a change in someone, there is that sort of that stigma, that taboo, oh, I can't ask them that question. So I think it's about really looking at that and for organisations to sort of and top management to really go to that place and really look at sort of reverse engineering the model. I want, what I would like to see is them, strip it back to that level and to with that meaningful consultation with employees, to really, have those opportunities where all different levels of the organisation have a voice, have an opportunity to flesh it out, and then, in collaboration with human resources as well, implement processes through occupational health and safety, and I suppose through the implementation of ISO 45003. I think because that has sort of that global reach as well, where they have the mechanism in place to be able to look at the management system to follow them, really, rather than turning and saying, well, I don't really know what to do in the organisation. It's all there. It's out there for you to be able to follow. So, but really empowering top management to realise that if they do this, like any sort of transformational change, you're going to have that denial, that resistance to start with. But there is going to be that sort of, implementation, exploration phase, and then that commitment to it. And they'll realise that it will lead to greater productivity. It will lead to, safer, trustworthy workplaces, which in the long run will have that competitive advantage, and it is ultimately a source of resilience for high performing teams, which will bring benefit to the organisation, because ultimately it is a business at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, well, that's quite a lofty goal. I reckon it's probably going to take a number of years to get to that point. But as you say, hopefully things like the new international standard 45,003 will give law firms more of a roadmap on how to get there. And then obviously the work that you're doing with IBA as well, and distilling that information and making it accessible.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's what we're working towards, really just, trying to highlight the fact that it does need that risk management lens, because we do realise that those soft approaches aren't really going to cut it. So, and as we're saying, we talk about in Australia, we're even seeing regulation creeping in now, where that because there is the realisation that these approaches are not successful. And I think even in the legal profession, I think we will start to see regulation even in terms of continuing professional development. And that happened some couple of years ago in relation to ethics, where it was regulated that one of the mandatories for CPD needed to touch on an ethical and professional responsibility component. And I think most definitely we're starting to point towards psychosocial hazard as being also something that may well be regulated as well.
So Desi, if our listeners have been loving what you're talking about and they're keen to get involved in improving psychological health and safety in law firms, do you have any words of advice for them?
I think it's just about, sort of just advocacy as well. In Victoria, I know through the Law Institute of Victoria, there's the Wattle Committee, which is a wellbeing committee, really where different members of the profession can be involved in as well. But most definitely, I just think there needs to be sort of a bit more of a platform as well for us to join. There's the Wellness in Law organisation, which is an organisation of academics. It's members of the profession, also the judiciary as well. So that's a really good opportunity where they generally come together and share different resources and insights as well around where we're going in the profession and what needs to be done. So I would say that's probably a first sort of a first point to really get involved with them, and depending on their bar society or law society, really just to get involved, as there's some good initiatives. The Victorian Legal Services Board and Commissioner, they did a report, and obviously there's a couple of different committees within that as well that are sort of driving the conversation forward. And I think we're going to start to see a lot, especially with the work of the IBA, especially with sort of the publishing of ISO 45003. I think because it's really going to start to sort of shake things up a little bit about the importance of maintenance of psychological safety.
Excellent advice. Thank you.
Now, Desi, I don't think we could have had anyone better on the show to talk about the hazards associated with practicing law and working in law firms. So thank you so much for your first-hand insights. That was really amazing. Joelle has got her work cut out for her to add in all the references to the show notes that you have made. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and sharing your work and the work of the IBA. And we really look forward to what's going to happen in the future in law firms and the adoption of things like 45,003. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason. And if anybody does want any of the links to the actual survey findings, happy to share them through Joelle as well, for the podcast link as well.
Joe will be reaching out to you for sure to chuck them in the show notes. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
That'll save us some time. So that brings us to the end of today's episode, listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, we do publish the videos on our Flourish DX YouTube channel. So if you want to check out the video rather than listen to the podcast, you're welcome to find your way over there. And for those of you who can't hack a long format podcast, there are some of you out there with the short attention spans. So we've got you covered. We have the little 3 to 4 minute clips, and there'll be some great ones that Joe will pull out of this conversation that will go on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. Joel and myself are very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to throw us a follow or connect with us, we're very happy to continue the conversation over LinkedIn. But that brings us to the end. Thanks again, listeners, and we'll catch you next episode.